approach in the book Contextualization in the Old Testament is to propose that Christianity is actually Asian at its core. Because if we look at what Asia encompasses, what we would now call the Middle East was originally the ancient Near East, but once we even move beyond those kinds of terms that center Europe as the middle of the world, we realize that where Christianity and Judaism originated was actually ancient West Asia. We so often think of Asia as South Asia or East Asia, and Central Asia is barely Asia. But by the time we get to what people call the Middle East, they're not even thinking in terms of Asia anymore. Technically speaking, the Asian continent extends all the way to much of what we would call the Middle East, West Asia. Christian faith has always had that kind of Asian contextual dimension. This book tries to recover that. It's not arguing against the West or for Asia in ways meant to replace one kind of cultural superiority with another. That would be a mistake. But rather to say that the gospel, as it's found in the Old Testament, the way in which Yahweh reveals himself to his people, is going to be culturally situated.
This is Out of the Margins podcast.
The podcast space, especially in the Christian world, is saturated by Western voices. But if we want a diversity of thought to face the future together, we need to step back and hear voices from out of the margins.
Here, we will be offering insights from experiences and perspectives from the majority world. My name is Edgar.
And I'm Simon.
And on each episode, we will be bringing to you our conversations with pastors, leaders, and scholars from the majority world.
This podcast is brought to you by Young Langham Australia.
Hey Simon, how are you?
Yeah, good thanks, Edgar. How are you? It's starting to heat up here in Australia. How's it going in Mexico?
Yeah, it's the other way around. Here it's starting to cool down because we are in fall now, but soon it will be winter at the end of November. So it's starting to cool down.
Tell me, what are winters like in Chihuahua?
Because Chihuahua is mainly desert, so in winter it's quite cold and it even snows. So it will be quite cold.
That's very exciting to me as a Queenslander. I would love to see that.
Yeah. So Simon, is the last episode for the season.
I think it's been a really great season. I would encourage people to continue to engage with all the books that we've been talking about this season. We've had a lot of really good conversations this season.
Yeah, and I think we're finishing this season with a great episode. What are we talking about?
Yes, I think in some ways we come back to our roots as a podcast with this one. We're talking about contextualizing the Old Testament in Asian perspectives. I speak with Dr. Jerry Hwang. He's a Chinese-American scholar. He's the academic dean and associate professor of Old Testament at Singapore Bible College. And he, along with one of his colleagues, has edited together Contextualization of the Old Testament from Asian perspectives. So we had this amazing conversation about how we translate to different languages, how we bring the contextualization to such a wide variety of different cultural and socioeconomic and religious perspectives. And also even just how do we define Asia itself when that can be such a broad and sometimes maybe even nebulous concept. So it's a really good conversation and a great way to end off our podcast.
Yeah. And also I heard that he likes Mexican food. So
I think anybody who's tried Mexican food likes Mexican food. I think that's the rule.
Well, let's go ahead and listen to the episode then.
Fantastic. So, Jerry, it's a pleasure to have you on the Out of the Margins podcast. Can I ask you the first question? Could you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you're currently doing in your life and ministry?
Yeah, thanks very much, Simon, for having me on the podcast. It's a delight to be with you, given the relationship I've had with Langham and the opportunity to publish with Langham through the Asia Theological Association, and also be able to serve in Langham publications now. To connect to all of you working with the next generation is really exciting. There have been so many Langham scholars who've been my friends. I'm not a Langham scholar myself. I enjoy working within that world. I am what might be called a Chinese American. in the country that I was born in, ABC meant American-born Chinese rather than Australian-born Chinese.
Sure.
My parents were born in China, grew up in Taiwan, and I grew up in the great state of California, a place with lots and lots of East Asian and South Asian people. So I was surrounded by these different cultures as I was growing up. During that time, we were a relatively traditional immigrant Chinese family, which meant that we didn't have any Christian background. But late in my high school years, I went to church along with some friends and family members and became a Christian around then and started to sense the axis of my life turning away from what had been promised to me was the path to success and glory and all of those different definitions that immigrant culture and its subcultures will give you. To make a long story short, I landed first in the IT field for a while, then worked as a pastor and became a missionary with my wife overseas as we served in Singapore with OMF International. And finally, I returned to the States 2 years ago. I'm continuing to serve in theological education in various institutions and do writing. I also work as a Bible translator for the New Living Translation, looking after the revision of the Pentateuch. And that revision of the New Living Translation probably won't be ready for another 6 to 8 years, though, so don't hold your breath.
Well, I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, thanks. It has been so much fun to work with other scholars in close quarters as we wrestle with the meaning of the text for today, as we have the original languages in front of us.
Oh, I imagine that must be a really rewarding experience.
Yeah, it's really a highlight of what I get to do.
Yeah, fabulous. Now, tell me, as someone growing up in California with this Chinese background, what was your favorite dish from when you were young? And I'd love to know, was it more of the American food or the Chinese food that you were interested in when you were growing up?
Yeah, food is a heart language for all sorts of people. If you want to touch the heart and bypass the head, have food. I grew up quite bicultural. I have my favorite foods from both Western cuisines as well as from Asian cuisines. So growing up in California, there's always a lot of good Mexican food around, especially when I was spending my early adult years in Southern California. It's really not that far from Mexico. And I like to think that people who've spent their lives in Southern California pick up aspects of the Spanish language and Mexican culture almost by osmosis. It's everywhere around you. Mexican food has always been a real highlight. There really is no sort of tried and true American food. It's a hodgepodge of different kinds of cuisines. On the Asian side of things, I witnessed a definite progression in the kinds of Chinese food that were available from my early childhood going into my university years. Because when I was first growing up, the oldest Chinese communities in California came from southern China, places like Guangdong province. Dim sum for a long time was the only kind of Chinese food that was available. But in the 70s and the 80s, there were more and more immigrants from Taiwan. Different kinds of food from Taiwan became available in the late 70s and the 80s. And then in the 90s was when the very large wave from China started to come over with all of its diversity and different kinds of food. It has become really dominant in the restaurant scene. The kind of Chinese food that I really enjoyed as I was growing up would be the different kinds of food from Taiwan. Beef noodle soup, and all that stuff is really comfort food. And if I'm making you hungry, we could just spend the rest of this podcast talking about food. That's the way to connect with people across barriers. I'm glad that you started with food. There are many favorites.
We could be talking about food for the rest of the day, but how about we move on to contextualization? Why is it important? Contextualization is something that we've talked a lot about on this podcast, but I'd love to hear from your perspective why it's important and what specific barriers do you find contextualizing the biblical message to Asian culture?
That's a really important question, Simon. When I was living and serving in Southeast Asia, this was a burning question for a lot of folks because in that vast and rich part of the world, every country in Southeast Asia, except for Thailand, had been ruled at one time or another by a Christian empire from the West or a country that considered itself Christian. You can go down the list of all the countries in Southeast Asia, and much the same is true in East Asia as well as South Asia. The contextual nature of Christian faith has been part of the story of Asia itself, as the gospel arrived from other places, not just in the heyday of European imperialism, even before that. But the question has always been whether Christianity is foreign or not. Specifically, when Christian imperialism of the European and North American varieties became the bearer of Christian faith, is Christian faith something that always involves violence and suppressing local cultures? The question of whether Christianity can ever be native rather than foreign is very pertinent. There are different approaches to this issue. My approach in the book Contextualization in the Old Testament is to propose that Christianity is actually Asian at its core, because if we look at what Asia encompasses, what we would now call the Middle East was originally the ancient Near East, but once we even move beyond those kinds of terms that center Europe as the middle of the world, we realize that where Christianity and Judaism originated was actually ancient West Asia. We so often think of Asia as South Asia or East Asia, and Central Asia is barely Asia. But by the time we get to what people call the Middle East, they're not even thinking in terms of Asia anymore. Technically speaking, the Asian continent extends all the way to much of what we would call the Middle East, West Asia. Christian faith has always had that kind of Asian contextual dimension. This book tries to recover that. It's not arguing against the West or for Asia in ways meant to replace one kind of cultural superiority with another. That would be a mistake. But rather to say that the gospel, as it's found in the Old Testament, the way in which Yahweh reveals himself to his people, is going to be culturally situated. And that's not an enemy of faith. That's actually an ally, because it shows us how faith can remain fresh precisely because of its cultural clothing, not despite its cultural clothing. So this leads me to a slightly different understanding of contextualization than some others in the field. I've learned a lot from everyone who went before me, but I do approach contextualization somewhat differently.
That's really fascinating, and it actually helps me to lead to the next question. How do you go about defining Asia when that category is quite messy? How far do you go in terms of the Middle East up into the Russian steppes? Where is Asia for you in terms of contextualizing?
When we look at the Asia Theological Association or the Asia Bible Commentary series, most people following those conventions will usually define Asia geographically as the whole landmass, which would include much of the people from the Slavic cultural blocks. There's a recognition also that this term Asia is somewhat of an artificial one. It's not one that goes all the way back to ancient times among Asian people themselves. The term Asia originates in the Greco-Roman world as they decide to call themselves Europeans and everyone east of them Asia. That's why we see these interesting references to Asia even in the New Testament, the province of Asia, but referring to Asia Minor because that was the name of the Roman province. The Europe-Asia contrast has long been a way of talking about us and them in the more Western mind. Now, that's history we can't change, and people on the continent of Asia have adopted that label. We speak of this continent as Asia and people from there as Asians, but it actually masks a huge amount of diversity. In the United States, what it means to be Asian American is almost this impossible hodgepodge of different groups. Everyone from Pakistani American, new immigrant, to a Japanese American whose ancestors have been in the country for over 100 years would all fall under that rubric of Asian American. So it is a messy term, just like you were saying, Simon. But kind of following conventional usage, I worked with East Asia and South Asia as the main places I would focus as I was looking at how the Old Testament fits into that world, sometimes called the Far East. The Middle East, where Judaism and Christianity originated, was sometimes known as the Near East. And all of these terms were used based upon their proximity to Western Europe. There are real cultural points of contact between the Near East and the Far East. This is where the Old Testament provides a model for how the message of God in that place could pick up aspects of that culture while transforming them. And that is at the heart of what contextualization is all about. I used case studies from Israel's world in the ancient Near East, and also case studies in modern South and East Asia, doing a comparison to illustrate how sometimes all of these tools can help us move beyond merely Western ways of reading the Old Testament.
Thank you very much. In your book, Contextualization in the Old Testament, you say that translation is the beginning of the contextualization process, especially with your experience with the New Living Translation. Tell me, what are some of the challenges translating the Old Testament, especially into Asian languages? What is the cultural and linguistic shift from Semitic languages to Southeast Asian languages?
Great question, Simon. This has been on my mind every time I'm thinking about how to help the New Living Translation continue to speak for a new generation. Translation is an interesting thing. There's an old Italian proverb that says the translator is a traitor, because you're trying to bridge two worlds. You're trying to be faithful to your source material, but you cannot avoid creating new meaning, conceptual associations in your target language. Translation is all about sitting astride not just two systems of vocabulary and grammar and syntax, but actually trying to bridge between two cultures. And in any act of translation, something new emerges. In the case of translating the Bible, you're offering people in a language that they previously used for non-biblical purposes. People would do commerce, they would conduct family life, they would have their everyday routines in this language. When the Bible is translated using a combination of non-religious and religious terminology, then you're giving people the Word of God, an idiom in that new language. You're participating in an act of what we might almost call theological creation, because the translator sits there and tries to figure out, how do we take a biblical concept like praise or worship? What's the proper equivalent in another language? In a target language, praise and worship might be associated with a human king. The translator has a decision to make. Are we going to use terms associated with the human ruler and extend them by analogy for God himself? Or do we create brand new terms so that we don't mix old concepts with new concepts, but then run the risk of implying that this is a foreign religion? So it's always a mix of old and new. This is first and foremost a question when we decide what to call deity in any language. Yeah. Every language has terms for deity. If you use old terms, there's continuity, but the possibility of confusion. If you use a new term, then there's no confusion, but you've got likely a foreign deity. When the Bible was translated into Chinese, for example, there were terms for deity already present in the Chinese language. And at that point, disputes broke out between missionary translators as they were trying to decide between using old terms and new terms and how much connection to make to traditional Chinese ideas of what a God was. And we can talk about that some more. These are some of the basic challenges in any kind of translation and contextualization process. Every act of translation involves interpretation, since you're trying to decide how to map two worlds that don't exist in a one-to-one relationship. Some of your mappings will need to change, and that's what translation does.
I think that's very helpful. If we talk a little bit more about the concept of deity, I think that's something that we share in the West, the concept of Elohim versus Yahweh, and how we translate that, and what it means to be a spiritual being versus the one true God. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? What are the challenges bringing that into an Asian context?
I'm glad you talked about an Asian context, because to speak for all of Asia is generalizing to such an extent.
Yeah.
It might be true somewhere, but how could it be true everywhere? If we were to pick one particular Asian context when it comes to these issues of translating God's name, we could look to the nations of Southeast Asia that are Islamic in orientation, whether informally or formally. These are fascinating places because in these cultures, they have their indigenous language. These languages have been influenced by Islam. Words from the Quran have entered the language. In languages such as Malaysian and Indonesian, Allah, the word they have for God. This is a word from Arabic that has been borrowed into these languages. Even when Christians read their Bibles in Malaysian or Indonesian, within this culturally Muslim context, their own Christian Bibles refer to God as Allah. Now, all of that sounds very foreign to someone who's a Westerner and used to thinking of Allah as a foreign word, and not just a foreign word, but as a proper name for the God of Islam. The way I often summarize it for people is that when a Westerner hears God, hears Allah, then they think of Allah as being the God of Islam. But when we look at how Christians, even in the Middle East today, including Islamic countries in Asia, the fact is that in Arabic, Allah has always meant God as a class of spiritual being. Because of the rise of Islam, the interreligious dialogue, the pertinent question now is whether Allah is God. Once we realize that there are linguistic issues at work, that helps to clarify things greatly. So we have to distinguish between names, titles, and appellations. Once we get clearer about these things, we realize how lacking that cultural background and trying to pray to our God leads to all sorts of interesting confusion. When we get together with our brothers and sisters to pray, we might address the one to whom we're praying as God, Jesus, Lord, but not realizing that God could be either a class of spiritual being, or if we mean it in the capital G sense, it could be a form of direct address. Jesus is a name, Lord is a title, as well as Christ is a title. It always reminds me of how confused children get in some of our church Sunday schools when the teacher asks them, what is Jesus' name? And they think, well, Jesus, is that a title? I guess he's just Mr. Christ. Christ must be the name of Jesus. Well, sometimes we don't have those categories unless we step outside of our cultural frame of reference. And the English language and a lot of Western Christians have become heirs to Christian heritage to such an extent that the Bible's own distinctions between names and titles and appellations is sometimes lost on us. And then we get super confused when we encounter Islam for the first time.
That's really interesting. And I think that here in the West, some of those difficulties with translation, a lot of the Dawa guys in England use those difficulties with translation to argue about Jesus' deity. I think that's very important for us to be aware of as we seek to build the kingdom here as well. So tell me, you talk about the challenges of contextualizing the concepts of covenant and kingship in the Old Testament. Perhaps again, there's an example specifically of that into an Asian culture or to the broader Asian culture.
We can take each of those in turn. Covenant is one of those churchy words. We don't always know what to do with a word like that. And that's another unintentional consequence of having Christian heritage. We know what these words are, but sometimes we've so invested them with tradition and other kinds of meaning that we need to unlearn some of our traditions and to get at the real meaning. Covenant is one of those words. Covenant to a lot of people nowadays, especially in a Western context, will mean something like contract. The legal overtones are really prominent for a lot of people as they look at that word covenant. Because much of the West tends more to an individualistic rather than a collectivist orientation, it's kind of hard for us to understand how the Old Testament context looked at covenant as a family matter that extends not just to your immediate family, your nuclear family, but also to your clan, your tribe. Ultimately, the whole nation is viewed as a family, ultimately with Yahweh and also with his creation. We think of ourselves, thanks to Western philosophy, as being bounded individuals who are sometimes almost like a mind or a brain or a will on a stick. There are really important concepts that come out of that Western philosophical tradition, like the soul and other important ideas going all the way back to Augustine. One of the challenges in having that kind of heritage is that we don't always know how to think of covenant as a familial matter that extends beyond our immediate blood relations. In anthropology, this idea identified not just in non-Western cultures, but in Western cultures is called fictive kinship, that we don't look at the family as just ending with our blood relations. And so once we approach a concept like covenant from the other end of the cultural spectrum, it makes a lot more sense. It's not merely legal. It includes legal ideas, but would actually be more relational at the core. So the familiar ideas we apply to our own biological family actually apply to the whole nation. When Yahweh says in the Old Testament, for example, in Deuteronomy 14, that you are my sons and daughters, we instinctively have a Christian category for what it means to be a child of God, but we don't often link that back to our very real existence as physical people in physical families with flesh and blood. Once these concepts can be approached from a less Western perspective, they really come alive. Kingship is another one. We can talk about that in a moment. I hope that begins to unpack how covenant can make better sense once we get past what I think is sometimes a Reformation and Protestant fixation on covenant as a legal matter. All discussions about law and grace have covenant in them, but sometimes our categories are a bit misshapen from the way Christian history unfolded in Europe, North America, and the rest of the West.
I think that's really helpful because sometimes we can push back on that concept of law and covenant. What's important is that law and covenant conception is part of the picture, but not the whole thing. We need to be able to see it with all its beauty and complexity, and hearing from people from the majority world speaking outside of our context is really helpful for that.
And when we bring in more communal ideas of family, then there's less of a cultural gap in trying to understand covenant as a collective phenomenon and not just sort of, my own interior individual faith.
Yeah.
But to be a member of a larger body of God's people has been a great help to me, just drawing on some Asian cultural categories there.
And it really helped us to have a more robust sort of ecclesiology, the way we think about church. Tell me about kingship then.
Kingship is a super interesting phenomenon. If you approach it only from a Western perspective, the memory of kingship in Western cultures has generally not been very good. There's the famous but probably apocryphal statement of Louis XIV, I am the state in French. The memory of kingship, especially religiously legitimated kingship in Western cultures, has been one of great suspicion. A lot of what we classify under Western secularism is a response to that mixing of religion with politics. Kingship in most Western cultures is almost like this ceremonial or ornamental affair nowadays. It's almost an overreaction to Western-style royal hegemony. There's a real fear of approaching kingship in that way. When we adopt a less Western perspective about kingship, we can see how this very common notion known as sacral kingship, religiously legitimated kingship, has actually been the most prominent form of human government in human history. So how do we contextualize the Old Testament's own understandings of kingship within that world? It does help when you begin with certain non-Western cultures, such as those found in Asia or Africa. Sacral kings have been a part of the cultural landscape for a long time. When kings are not just King Arthur or Louis XIV, who are typically demonized in Western literature and culture, but they're real entities. People in much of Asia live in countries where there still are real kings and queens. And then our understanding of something like kingship becomes less abstract and more concrete. Asian categories can definitely help with kingship. Sacral kingship does have its darker side. In Japan and China, for example, the notion of the king as the son of heaven who enforces the mandate of heaven is a real thing and has led to cultural problems, of course. But when we realize that the ancient Near East, Israel's world, had a similar concept, even the very first chapter of our Bible comes alive. Yeah. When Genesis 1 talks about being made in the image of God applied to all people, male and female. That is already a radical act of contextualization. In those traditional cultures, the only person made in the image of the God is the monarch, the royal leader. In the ancient world, as well as those modern but still traditional societies, people think of sacral kingship as leading to a three-tier society, with gods in the top tier as the image of God in the second tier and regular people in the bottom level. But when Genesis 1 comes along and says all people are made in the image and likeness of God, this flattens the hierarchies in important ways. If we didn't have that background, it almost feels commonplace to say all people are made in the image of God. How radical that is lost on us if we don't have non-Western perspectives on what kingship is. And when we bring those in, the Old Testament is doing major surgery on traditional notions of kingship. Without that background, it's all foreign to us.
Thank you very much. Tell me about how that legal and individualistic context coming from the Reformation has been such a strong view in the West. But tell me about honor and shame and guilt in an Asian context and how we can see that in contextualization.
I want to mention at the outset that the person who has probably done more in Old Testament scholarship to advance the discussion than anyone else is someone right from down under. Dr. Dan Wu at Moore College has written a fantastic book titled Honor, Shame, and Guilt, in which he applies the latest social scientific work to a reading of honor, shame, and guilt in the book of Ezekiel. I hope some of the people tuning in could reach out and find that book because he's done a phenomenal job in synthesizing a lot of material. His work is the exception, unfortunately. Usually, in both biblical scholarship and missiology, there have been ways of talking about honor and shame as being unique to the non-Western world. This guilt orientation is characteristic of the Western world. And that kind of reductionism is what Dr. Wu spends a lot of time overcoming in showing how honor, shame, and guilt are all present to differing degrees and in different kinds of configurations in all cultures. This is really the outstanding insight of the book. I think there are some generalizations that we might make coming out of the Reformation, especially because of the nature of medieval culture, Western Europe's own history, and also the Catholic Church's own disposition during this time. Much of Western Europe does labor with what the New Testament scholar Christopher Sandel famously called the introspective conscience of the West. This is probably the most famous article ever written in New Testament studies by Stendhal. I think he was teaching at Harvard by that time, but he's originally from Scandinavia. What he's basically arguing is that much of the West, with assistance from both Augustine in the 5th century and about 1,000 years later with Martin Luther starting the Reformation, innovate, and which becomes part of Western European culture, is a fixation on an understanding of relationship with God that revolves around this notion of guilt, whether it's legal guilt in the sense of having broken a law or a sense of emotional guilt, feeling crushed for your sins. The word guilt in English kind of does double duty. Now, it's difficult to disentangle those fruits of the Reformation in recovering the true gospel from what also is happening during that time with the Enlightenment, the rise of individual conscience, and how this plays out in the work of philosophers like Descartes and Kant. To compress a really long history, people have landed on the notion that the West majors in guilt, which is more of an individual and interior disposition with reference to an objective law. The contrast there, the foil, is sort of the non-Western world that majors in the collective and public notion of honor and shame. So basically, this has been reduced sometimes to what's right versus what people think. Once I frame it, you can see immediately that these categories for us and them don't really work. And in much more sophisticated ways, this is what Dr. Wu is showing in his book. When we see a lot of the time in missiology from the West, people are saying, well, we have this guilt orientation and they have this honor shame orientation. This is both helpful but misleading because it pretends that people in the non-Western world have no notion of objective truth or standards for morality, and people in the West are purely driven by their sense of what is right. These are unrealistic dichotomies. Once we bring all of these factors in play and adopt a more robust model, which I argue for in the book, in approaching honor, shame, and guilt, then we can read the Old Testament better. So it's generally true that guilt is prominent in the experience of most Westerners, and honor and shame can be prominent in the experience of a lot of non-Westerners. So after going through all of that, how do we understand what the Old Testament does in that world? If we think of the Old Testament as being more traditional or perhaps Eastern in its cultural orientation, when the Old Testament teaches critical thinking, when it challenges power, when it overturns hierarchy, then this notion of honor, shame, society receives a major challenge from the Old Testament itself. And so when the Old Testament is doing that kind of theological work in its world, it truly stands in and above human cultures at the same time. That's the argument that I made in that chapter of the book.
Thank you very much. I think perhaps that could be an entire podcast on its own. But
yeah, and you would have managed to get Dr. Wu at some point. I think he would be a great person. At least his English accent would match yours, rather than people having to fumble listening to struggling with either you or me in our English accent.
I'm quite certain that they'll struggle with me a lot more than with you.
He's a great scholar from down under, and Australia has produced so many wonderful Christians and dear friends of mine.
It's something that I'm also interested in understanding further, the chapter of your book on creation and pantheism. How can Asian cultural context help us in the West have a more robust theology of creation?
Creation is kind of like the ugly duckling within a lot of Western theology. For a long time, people thought the Old Testament was almost like a mirror of Western culture and philosophy. The Old Testament approaches its world by removing this notion of creation as alive. It overcomes these traditional superstitions. And in that kind of argument, Genesis was seen doing something called demythologization. The rest of the world around Israel believed that the sun and the moon, the stars were alive in the way a pantheist might believe. Everything is God, God is everything, or the gods are everything. So that the entire created order is deeply supernatural and spiritual at the same time. The Old Testament was usually thought in Western scholarship of that period to come along and say that, well, there's only one true God. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And through his speech, he turns what other cultures thought were gods just into things. For these reasons, creation theology has always kind of been met within the Western tradition with at least some skepticism. Are we returning to sort of a tree-hugging pantheism in which there are spirits dwelling in every rock and around every corner? And because of that worldview is associated a lot of the time with primitive cultures, people can operate with this almost unconsciously evolutionary schema and thinking that we're enlightened now. We have a scientific worldview. We know that water is H2O. We know that the sun is a ball of gas and they don't harm people. So this loses something essential about the Old Testament, which is that when the God of the Old Testament is Lord over all, it involves literally being the God of gods and the Lord of lords. These are the kinds of statements that are really familiar to us. But if we stop and think about what it means to be a God with some kind of supernatural power, we have to check whether our understanding of a biblical concept like monotheism, the idea that there's only one God, might owe more to the kind of philosophical materialism that I just described, or if it actually is rooted in the Old Testament itself. Now, all that sounds really lofty, so let me just give us a really concrete example. Okay, so when we have statements that there is no one like our God, these are everywhere in the Old Testament. We have to think carefully about what kind of comparison that is. This draws upon the chapter on the Yahweh and El and Allah questions earlier in the book. When we say that something is of one kind, are we talking about one and only in the sense that there's nothing else in the same class? Or are we saying that it's the best in class? If we say that there is none like you, is it meant to be a literal statement that there's no one else in the same class? Or is it that everyone in the same class is inferior? I think both kinds of theological statements can be found in the Old Testament, but even from our regular life, we know intuitively that a comparison of something with nothing is not much of a compliment, right? Mm-hmm. If I were to say to my daughter, "You're my favorite daughter," she knows that's not much of a compliment. And then she would retort and say, "Well, yeah, I'm your only daughter. I'm also your least favorite daughter." So we have to take comparability statements like that in their context. So in a world in which people really did think of other gods as existing, think of the ark narrative in 1 Samuel 4-7, for example. I mean, Dagon exists. People attribute real power to him. He gives power to the Philistines to overcome the Israelites. The Philistines are so excited about this, they assume that their god Dagon is more powerful than Yahweh. That's why they take the ark back to Philistia. Both Israelites and Philistines thought of Dagon as being real and Yahweh as being dead. That's why Dagon won the battle. So that's a world in which supernatural power is real. Now, what we know about that ark narrative is that it's actually the funniest passage in the entire Old Testament. Once the Philistines take the ark back to Philistia, it's clear that Yahweh is alive, but Dagon is dead. The Israelites gave up on Yahweh because they thought taking the ark into battle would ensure their victory. They lose. The Philistines assume that Dagon is stronger, and they think that Yahweh is weaker. But then they wake up the next morning, and Dagon is flat on his face before the ark. So the God of Israel is unique, not because he's the only one who exists, but because he's uniquely powerful to beat other gods' strength using his weakness. This is the remarkable thing. The Philistines never learn about Yahweh's power and weakness unless he allows the ark to be taken by the Philistines. And then this ark of the covenant goes on what we might call a short-term mission trip to Philistia to show the Philistines that the God of the Israelites, whom the Israelites had already given up on, is actually more powerful than their God. These are the ways in which monotheism is true, not by a comparison of something with nothing, but by Yahweh being of the same class as the other gods, but clearly being in a class of his own at the same time. Once we realize that the fear of pantheism has given us a truncated view of what it means to be God, this is sort of the God of modernity, ever shrinking into a God of the gaps, as science explains more. Once we realize that the entire Old Testament is saturated with the supernatural worldview, then the God of the Old Testament isn't afraid of pantheism. He rules over the other deities rather than us needing to deny that they exist. It ends up being a smaller God if he's, by definition, the only one in his class, rather than being at the head of his class. So these are some of the discussions that come up in the chapter on creation and pantheism. And I also looked at other passages in which creation is real. It does seem to have supernatural power, but it's still subordinate to Yahweh. That's the key insight of the final chapter.
I mentioned that might be controversial to some of our listeners, but I think it's well worth continuing to chew on because it really helps to understand.
And for any of the listeners who have connections to South Asia, that chapter also has an extensive discussion of Hinduism and Hinduism's understanding of the material and spiritual world and how Old Testament faith fits into all of that.
Thank you so much. What do you feel is the most important part of contextualizing the Old Testament in our pursuit to bring into Asia? I think we've talked about how that's a very broad question, but is there something particular that we in the West are blind to that would really help us?
I've pondered this question of yours, and really the entire book is an attempt to answer that question in some ways. I think when it comes to blind spots, it's less an issue of knowledge and information and concepts, so much as it is a lack of cultural intelligence, which assumes that the Bible reinforces our own culture. In the long association of Christianity with the West, it has often been noted by both Westerners and non-Westerners that Christendom and Christianity seemed almost identical. That way of looking at the world can sometimes leave out the Old Testament. So I like to tell people that I teach the weird parts of the Bible. All of us who are Old Testament professors have the same set of occupational hazards. There are always going to be questions about certain topics, the God of the Old Testament, what seems like Canaanite genocide, these obscure laws, and these are all things about the Old Testament that people find strange. The New Testament feels less strange. What happens for people of a more Western orientation is that it becomes easy to overlook the Old Testament because it just feels too foreign. People who are more Western in orientation and who prize the New Testament over the Old Testament are going to be stuck sometimes in a feedback loop in which the foreignness of the Old Testament becomes intimidating and also reflects a closedness to non-Western cultures. In the book, I attempted to illustrate how an acquaintance with non-Western cultures, such as those in Asia, helps to unlock aspects of the Old Testament that were unfamiliar. For those who know the Old Testament but don't know Asia, going into the Old Testament can also be a way of opening cultural understanding beyond the unfamiliar world of the Bible to unfamiliar parts of the modern world today. You could say that the book is an extended study in what cultural intelligence might look like, especially with the Old Testament, Asian culture, and Western culture in the foreground. I encourage all of our listeners to examine the Old Testament, especially its unusual, unfamiliar, and strange elements, because at those moments, we face a choice between retreating to a kind of Christian faith and cultural bubble that's safer and more familiar to us, or forging ahead and being curious about what we don't understand. The same disposition that allows us to be curious about the Bible, to admit that we don't know everything, that there is a real cultural, historical, and linguistic gap that separates us from the Bible. It's the same set of skills that will allow us to approach other cultures with greater respect and a desire to understand. So I could put it differently. The failure to take the Old Testament seriously sometimes can reflect a kind of cultural imperialism, that we've left the Old Testament behind. Now I know, what the Bible is all about. And now the Bible's message is in my hands for me to contextualize for other people. As soon as we start thinking that, well, I have faith and others have culture, that is a form of cultural imperialism. We think we know better than other people. Getting into the nooks and crannies and sometimes the odd parts of the Old Testament is a deeply personal act of spiritual formation that prepares us for mission. Once we start avoiding the big questions, we also become more open to other cultures and people as well. So that's my hope as people read the book.
I think you summed up the philosophy of the book, but also the philosophy of this podcast. Appreciate your answer to that question. That was fantastic.
Yeah, thanks so much, Stephen.
This is a question that we ask at the end of every one of these podcasts. If you have the opportunity to dispense one piece of wisdom or advice to all young Western Christians, what would it be?
This question gets to the heart of another issue of methodology that I address in the very first chapter. I think people who are in middle age or older probably grew up in a world with less cultural contact with people who were different from us. One of the amazing things about this modern world with the internet, travel, and migration is a much higher degree of cultural hybridity among young people worldwide today, not just young people in the West, but worldwide than there would have been even just a generation ago. The younger people have a more intuitive and keen sense of how there's really no such thing as pure cultures, and the boundaries that we sometimes draw between what's pure and impure are frequently man-made and sometimes artificially conceived to such an extent that they're ridiculous. This is a real asset for younger people. I remember growing up right in that Gen X demographic. We had to go out of our way as a family to find food. I guess we started with food and we can end with food. Our palate was much more limited. But when I see how my children are growing up, they can eat the world. It's at their doorstep. And you don't even have to live in a global city. Just last couple of days, I was taking my son to university in the home state I was born in. And when my parents lived there, they felt like they were on a cultural island. They were totally alone. They could hardly find anyone who looked like them, and they really struggled as immigrants. But when I took my son there to settle him into his dormitory, one of the last meals I had with him was at a Lebanese restaurant. that wasn't unfamiliar to us. We knew what to eat. We knew what to order. And we had a degree of contact with unfamiliar cultures that was so much higher than the world in which I grew up. And I think this is a strength that a lot of younger people have. But I would just give all of us an exhortation too, that just because we know what to order in every kind of restaurant, it doesn't necessarily reflect a genuine curiosity about the cultures and the people who produce that food. We may be able to eat the world, but if we still maintain a consumer-producer relationship with the people and the cultures that produce the food, that is, again, a form of cultural imperialism. Serve up your culture to me on my terms. There's not a lot of cultural humility there. But in the same way that we have the opportunity to encounter so many different kinds of food, let's go a step further and engage the people, the cultures, the heritages that produce that food, instead of trying to grab them and own them for ourselves. That's the difference between contextualization and cultural appreciation on one side and cultural appropriation on the other side, in which we're just trying to own, use, and redeploy someone else's culture for our own purposes. All of this is possible for younger people in ways that were not a generation ago. And I think there's so much potential as we gain in cultural understanding and realize that our own cultural heritage is not an obstacle to be overcome, but something to lean into as we seek to understand the rest of the world and also God's word better.
Well, that's a beautiful call for all of us. That's very exciting. Thank you so much, Jerry. It's been such a pleasure to speak to you. I think I need to get something to eat now.
Going to be lunchtime for you over there. So now you have to decide what to eat. You are what you eat in many ways. This is a beautiful way of thinking about our relationship to the rest of the world. We can enjoy other people's cultures, what they provide to us, but recognizing that all of these come from a deeply heartfelt place that we want to be curious about and learn from.
Thank you so much. Such a pleasure. And thank you so much for joining us on the Out of the Margins podcast. It's been a pleasure to have you and your wisdom.
Yeah, it's really my privilege to be on your podcast. Thanks, Simon, for having me.
Thank you.
I really enjoy your conversation with Dr. Jerry and all the insights that he brought and all the questions that you made him. And I think that it was such a great way for us to explore what it means to contextualize the Old Testament.
Oh my goodness. Yes, it was such a pleasure and a privilege to have this conversation with him. Edgar, what were your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's a great way to wrap up the season, talking about contextualization and even the challenges of translation. It brings back memories from our very first episode with Crystal, where she also talks about those challenges when translating the Bible into another language, trying to seek words that will connect with the readers in a specific context. I think is a great example and a great way to understand what contextualization means. As we have heard from Dr. Jerry, words as covenant or kingship can mean very different things. You can't just copy and paste those words from an English translation. You had to find the expressions and the words that will connect with people from this context.
Absolutely. I think there was so many things that we covered in this conversation. It was such a broad and rich conversation. But I think the major thing to take away is that this really defines what we're trying to do here with this podcast. This conversation has really helped us get back to our roots. What I want you to take away is to recognize the richness and depth that you can approach Scripture when you hear voices from the majority world. We thought about how we can get a richer and more robust theology of creation by seeing the context of people who come from a pantheistic background. We saw their concepts of kingship and of gods and just a variety of other things that can really help us to see things more deeply in Scripture. I think sometimes people can be a little bit wary of this stuff. They don't want to accidentally slip into pluralism. But I think that if we brave and we cling to our orthodoxy and to the gospel, this can really help us to have a rich understanding of God and who He is and of Scripture and its beauty and depth. So in a sense, I'm saying Continue to listen to voices from out of the margins.
Yeah. I really love the way he also closes talking about food. When you have Vietnamese or Japanese food, not only consume the food, but if you seek to understand more the culture, that will be a more enriching experience. In the same way, we really hope that you not only consuming these episodes and just receiving, but you also seek to understand and engage in your local context, in your community around. That will be such a great way to use these insights from all the amazing people we get a chance to interview.
Absolutely.
And like we said, this is our last episode for this season. It would be great if you can leave us on the comments. What would you like to hear about for next season? We would love to hear your thoughts, and how can we, also help you to listen to some of the stuff that you would like to hear.
And this is actually my last episode ever. It has been a real pleasure and a privilege to be able to have all these conversations with these wonderful people from around the world and to speak to you, Edgar. The podcast, God willing, will continue, so keep tuned in. We will continue hearing from voices from out of the margins. As you continue on, Edgar, I pray that you continue to see the richness in Scripture.
Thank you so much, Simon, for all that you brought to this podcast, the amazing conversations that you had, and your insights as well. And we really will miss you. I think people will miss you, and I will miss you, mate.
Yeah, absolutely. Continue on and continue listening to voices from out of the margins.